You're listening to talks from the Apostolic Johannite Church.
My talk today, what I'm going to be speaking on, kind of follows on from, in some ways, what Sean, I didn't know he was talking about it, spoke about in his homily today, follows on from what we did in the church today, in talking about the concept of ministry and priesthood within the context of Gnosticism. His Eminence, in his remarks, spoke about the fact that what we did today stands very much within the Western and Eastern Christian tradition of laying on of hands, the authority of the apostles being, passed down in much the same way as Lutherans, especially in the Scandinavian countries that still have apostolic succession, the Roman Catholic, the Eastern Orthodox, the Anglicans, they all do the same thing, and they're mainstream Christians. So why the heck do we as Gnostics, who really have a very different outlook on what we do and think and feel about a lot of stuff, why are we doing the same thing? What's the reason? Is there an antecedent reason within Gnosticism for us doing that? Or are we simply just copycatting what we see in the outside world in institutions that are much more popular than us and much more, well, I'll use the term successful loosely, successful in worldly terms. We did have conversations about Christianity and political power and things like that over dinner and stuff last night. So they're successful in those terms, but that's a different conversation for a different day, or we could be here for many, many hours. There's generally some accepted ideas when it comes to the study of ancient Gnosticism, because I'm going to start in the beginning and move to where we are now, that we need to understand that a lot of the sources we have available to us concerning who we call Gnostics are very limited, especially when we relate it to what we know about Orthodox Christianity. There's a good reason for that, because Orthodox Christianity won, and when you win the day, what does the conqueror do? They get rid of the conquered, and try and erase anything that's left and talk about them in a bad light. And anyone who's studied church history is well aware that most of our knowledge about these groups comes from the heresiologists. That's the only reason we know most of what we know. And so in reality, we could probably take it with a grain of salt. That being said, what information we do have does allow us to draw some conclusions about the role that the concept of holy orders or a clerical class may have played within these early Gnostic communities, remembering, of course, that we're talking about communities, not a community. There was no cohesive group at that time. It was pockets of people doing their thing, whether that was the proto-Orthodox, whether it was the Gnostics, whoever it was. Small communities, groups of families and people doing their thing, developed into bigger groups, some of them didn't, but not cohesive. So whilst the sources that we have suggest that Gnostic communities did have a leadership structure, they were often focused on one leader within the community, and it seems that maybe formal hierarchical structures weren't necessarily associated with that. There was a community leader, someone whose ideas we were focused around. They kind of led things, and there were most likely people who were older in the community. I was a believer before you were, so I take care of this sort of material going on. But the idea of that particular leadership class isn't necessarily strongly supported in most of the communities. Some scholars suggest the most common form of leadership to emerge within these communities was that of teacher and disciple, which we quite often see in other spiritual communities, even right up till today, that's, you have your monastic superior and they pass on the tradition to you and they make sure you're doing the right thing, not only in the Christian context, but in Eastern religion. You've got your yogi, and your yogi is the leader of your school, and that's the ideas that you take on and you follow along with them. So that same kind of concept appears to have potentially developed in that early Gnostic time. Now, whilst these leaders were, definitely teachers, which is something that's associated especially with the episcopacy, so with the place of a bishop within mainstream Christianity, the sense of this being connected with a sacramental, that kind of formalised identity and authority as being a tool of conformity to the norm, it appears largely wasn't part of the Gnostic understanding. And I suppose it comes down to the fact of what the Gnostic outlook on connection to the divine and salvation was. It wasn't, and now isn't about necessarily following the rules, but it's about understanding where we're from, who we are, where we're going, and how we get back to where we're going, and just doing it ourselves. We've got a good idea, we know how to get there, we don't need to necessarily be part of this mind think that sometimes that structured leadership can bring about. But it does have to be acknowledged that there were some Gnostic groups that did have structures extremely similar to the then proto-Orthodox Church. Particularly Marcion and the Marcionites had a very regular church structure and continued for a very long time, because, and I think in part because they were similar to the rising orthodoxy, and so people kind of like, oh, we're just doing the same thing, it's okay, we're kind of the same, and maybe that led to some of that success. Who knows? But they were kind of far and few between, that formalised sort of structure. So there's Marcion, and I don't think I'm talking about in particular, but the Manichaeans as well had a very formalised structure within the Persian Empire. There was a period where they became the religion du jour under one particular, I'm going from memory here, can't remember his name, one particular Persian king. So they had a strict priestly class that did the priestly things because they replaced the Zoroastrians as the state religion for a while. So of course they needed to have the same thing to fill that political position more than a spiritual position necessarily even. The religion of the state needed to continue. Oh, I wonder if that's what happened with Christianity. Oh, I wonder. Okay, amongst the modern sacramental churches, it's evident that one of the important roles of the clergy is bringing the sacraments to people through liturgical rites. Those of us who are clergy here, that's what we do. That's our main point of function to the community, is the fact that we have the mojo to perform those sacred rites that bring us into particular contact with the divine. While there's some evidence of rituals and sacraments being part of the ancient Gnostic tradition of some groups, a lot of groups, there's mention of them having their own rites and their own things. Sometimes they're mentioned as whacked out and weird things and, snakes and all sorts of wonderful stuff. Who knows? But whilst that was...
We shall not speak of the Carpocratians.
No, that's right. Whilst that's some of what's out there, little's really known about the exact nature of most of these rites, or even who was responsible for them within the community. Was it just that everybody took their turn? Was it that there was someone designated as the one who swung the snake during the ritual? Who knows? We just don't know. So there's very little evidence in the early Gnostic community of a particular clerical class. I do want to point out, though, that there is evidence that women were a part of leadership structures. In what little evidence there is evidence that women were prominent. They weren't just in the back of the pews covering their heads, not saying anything. They were quite active in that ancient period as well. And it's worth saying that that was true in proto-orthodoxy as well. If you read the Bible with the blinkers off, there are women leaders mentioned, and mentioned as apostles, workers with the apostles, leaders of communities, even if it's in association with their husband, whatever. But they're there. Women were there just as important. So it's an important thing to note. And often what critics would term laity or non-priestly people took leadership roles as well. So the heresiologists at times make pains of mentioning that, that laity sort of class, whether it's particularly probably having a swipe at education and social status and things like that, were leading communities. That's a reason why you don't want to go to those terrible Gnostics. It's just stupid Brenden who's in charge there. What does he know about anything? Come to us. I'm the intelligent one, and I'm the sat at the feet of the apostle, so some evidence of that kind of little nastiness between. As we know, and as I've already said, the burgeoning orthodoxy choked out the Gnostic communities that were rather prevalent at the time. It's not that there were just a few of them, there were a lot of them. Christianity was a broad and diverse, I was going to say church, but I don't want to use the word church, just a broad and diverse spiritual tradition in the period of post the apostles. We often think of it, or want to think of it, in terms of the box that we fit it in today, because, we know what Christianity is, it's that thing over there. And quite often it's that thing over there that we don't like, and I'm getting way off track. It's a term that I've had to come to terms with, that idea of Christianity, and being able to be comfortable with that word. But anyway, I forget where I was going with that. Down the garden path, obviously. Yeah. So that's the important takeaway. I don't know where I was going. I lost my train of thought. But Christianity was a spectrum. Nothing fit into a box. Communities only had their little piece of what was Christianity. There wasn't broad publication and discussion. Materials belonged to a community, and maybe someone took it to the community down the road once we were done with it and had copied it, and then it may have gotten taken. So there were 6 different copies with slightly different things of letters and books and scribblings and who knows, but largely an oral tradition as well amongst people who didn't have writing as part of their everyday life as well. So very broad, very diverse, very, kind of pluralist, like society is now to a degree. So it's almost like we've taken a step back in time in some ways in that respect of the way societies are. But Orthodox Christianity, or proto-Orthodox, strangled out that diversity, and basically we were left with an awfully long period of time where what we think of today as the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic churches were it. For a long time, there was no East and there was no West. It was one church. It was just the Christian church of the Roman Empire that eventually split into East and West, and that's a whole different talk. Of course, there were heresies along the way, and there were little enclaves of things that happened. I'm not going to talk about lots of stuff, because clearly we would be here till midnight if I put together a talk talking about every little group along the way and the leadership that they took. But I think we all know where I'm going to head next in the medieval period. There existed a number of different groups which the church considered heretical. 2 of the groups which are generally particularly considered to be Gnostic are the Bogomils and the Cathars. And we won't get into the discussion as to whether the Cathars actually existed or not. We're going to assume that they did. These groups shared an awfully striking similarity in structure and doctrine, with the Bogomil lineage eventually being shared with the Cathars. It has to be acknowledged that the depth of our knowledge about either of these groups, again, is very limited, and especially when it comes to the idea of structures of authority. We know some things, but the nature of some of the structures are left with big question marks because we just don't know. And you'll understand why when I talk a little bit further. So the Bogomils were an extreme dualistic Christian sect. So when we think of Gnostics, we think of world-hating dualists in the traditional sense. That's what they were. There was definitely no confusing them for what we think of in modern terms as Gnostics. They were around in sort of the 10th century, and they were named after their founder, strangely enough, called Bogomil. Yeah. There is some conjecture as to whether Bogomil actually really existed as a historical figure, but again, it's one of these things that we just take as written that he existed because, it works if he does. Bogomil and his teaching arose early in the process of the conversion of what we sort of think of today as Bulgaria to Christianity, and was starkly at odds with the teachings of both the East and the Western Church that were vying for Bulgaria. So by this point in time, Constantinople and Rome were two totally separate organisations. That happened in, we'll say 1054 for ease. And so in Christianising Europe, there was a fight between the two of them over a lot of different locales of who could get there first and who would get the land. And bits and pieces switched back and forward for a long time between the Eastern Empire and the Western, the remnants of the Roman Empire. But anyway, the Bogomils were in extreme conflict with both. As with the early Gnostic sects, very little Bogomil writing has continued to exist today. And in fact, very little writing about the Bogomils has continued to exist. The only book that I could find when I wrote this material was by some obscure Bulgarian historian, written in some really terrible prose that was really hard to read, and I wish I could remember his name. I think it had a blue cover, and if anyone's interested, I can get you the source, but it was a hard text to digest. But most of what we do know about them does come from people who were trying to undermine the Bogomils, particularly a priest of the Eastern Orthodox Church called Cosmas. Like the Bogomils, the Cathars were also extreme dualists and generally asserted a Docetist doctrine. However, unlike the Bogomils,
What does that mean?
Sorry?
What does that mean?
Why did I know you were going to ask me that? And I was going to say, I don't remember what it means. I've written it down.
It means Jesus was an appearance.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Jesus wasn't real in the sense of a physical human being because they're extreme dualists. Thanks, I needed the reminder. Because they were extreme dualists and Jesus was the Son of God, there's no way that God could take on mortal flesh, because mortal flesh is this evil, prison-like, encapsulating thing that we want to get away from. So Jesus was, for want of a better term, was ghost Jesus while he was here. Yeah.
Also known as the theology of Jesus didn't poop, as Jonathan Stewart called it.
Absolutely, because if you're a ghost, you don't have bodily functions. If you're a ghost, you don't eat. If you're a ghost, you can walk on the water. So to both Bogomils and, Cathars, Jesus wasn't a real historical figure in the sense of a human being. So nothing that happened to Jesus, say, crucifixion, for example, had a real sense of physicality. And of course, if it's not a physical repaying substitutionary atonement, well, basically you've just thrown out the whole of Eastern and Western theology, really. Mainstream Christian theology in mass, in very simple terms, is based on the fact that God needed a sacrifice big enough to wipe out our sins, because in the Garden of Eden we ruined everything, naughty humans. The only way to forgive for it was for God to, basically send his own beautiful child to shed blood and forgive our sins. So Docetism, no, because we don't need that stuff. That's the stuff of the nasty God and of this world, and there's no way that Jesus went through that. And Docetists and looking at the resurrection, at the crucifixion, have a lot of different ways of getting around it. If there was a real person, well, it wasn't Jesus. He was switched at the last minute, and ghosty Jesus went on to do post-resurrection ghosty things, And interestingly enough, talking about Islam, that's sort of the approach that Islam takes, is that Jesus wasn't actually crucified on the cross per se, that it was a bit of switcho, change-o, Yeah, Simon of Cyrene went there instead. But that's for different reasons, obviously not Docetism. So they were both Docetists, both dualists, but unlike the Bogomils, we have a lot more information regarding the Cathars, mainly due to the incredible record keeping of the Inquisition that went into that part of France to stamp out these terrible heretics.
By which stage everybody did expect the Spanish Inquisition.
Yes, that's right. We won't forget that my spiritual predecessor, St. Dominic, in a different life, was a Spaniard, and his brethren after him basically did run the Spanish Inquisition. Dominic himself didn't set up the Inquisition. That's a bit of a misnomer, but yeah, his dudes that he trained definitely did, and definitely did run it. So I apologise as a former Dominican for my brethren. Rightio, so whilst there's an array of information regarding Cathar life, most of it, of course, is written by heresy hunters and may be tainted by their love of hyperbole to justify their persecutions and their burnings and their murders and their stealing of property. Despite this, historians attempt to read past the biases of the records and present a picture of Catharism that allows us to evaluate their structure and the role of a clerical class in their organisation. With regards to their attitudes toward holy orders, the Bogomils represent a rather anti-clerical and anti-church group. During their early existence, there was no clerical class. Instead, members were split into two categories: the believers and the perfect. The perfect were those who had committed to the Bogomil way of life, whilst the believers were those that supported the perfect and received the Bogomil message, and as they were travelling around, put them up, fed them, housed them, took care of them. Likewise, the Cathars did exactly the same thing. They were split into two groups, much along the same lines. There was the perfecti, the perfect, who were committed to very strict austerity, strict vegetarianism, strict rules around sexuality, as in there was none, very strict rules around pretty much everything that they did. And they were the class that was particularly privy to the fullness of Cathar wisdom. And then there were the believers who were yet to make the commitment of the perfecti, but who were committed to doing so at some future time. Whether that may be, and it depends on what author you read, whether that be in another life or as their death approached. Quite often, Cathar believers would take the rite, the consolamentum, which made them a perfecti. Whilst it's not immediately clear that either of these groups were clerical in the sense that we think of it, of Western and Eastern sort of Christian milieu kind of people, in a sense the perfecti do demonstrate clerical elements. Both the Bogomils and the Cathars practice the similar types of initiations, which, as I said, Cathars termed the consolamentum, that raised a believer to a perfect, much like we had an ordination rite today that designated me a bishop, and I had one that's designated me a priest before that. They had a rite. And it's been described using the words being described as Baptism, confirmation, ordination, and if received at death's door, extreme unction all rolled into one. The consolamentum entailed the laying on of hands and repeated injunctions to live a flawless and chaste ascetic existence. Now, I don't think I talk about it, but they were so full on with that injunction that if one of the perfecti failed to live up to the standards, they were no longer a perfecti, but not only was that person no longer a perfecti, but anyone that they had given the consolamentum to in the past was no longer a perfecti. Because if I wasn't living up to it now, who says that I was living up to it when I did their consolamentum or theirs or theirs or theirs? So none of them count anymore. If I'm not perfect, nobody gets anything from me back throughout time. Which does raise a poor bit of a question for those who died after taking their consolamentum. They're now, I'm assuming maybe, coming around for another go.
Yeah,
you know?
It's a pretty, they took that pretty literally. So if I decided to, you know, go and empty the church bank account on hookers and blow, I'm not going to do that. But if I decided to just go off and go to Vegas and go nuts, you know, in that moment, I would no longer be a priest. But all the people downstream from me, which means Tim and Brenden, and, you know, everybody loses their thing. I mean, I would imagine you'd spend most of your time reordaining people. But yeah, it was that serious.
And I imagine that did happen. I imagine that once someone did something wrong, there was a lot of running around trying to get everything fixed up again. You know, even if that person never came back into the fold, I imagine there was a lot of, oh my God, you're not a perfect anymore, we need to do this again. You know, and people running around making sure that happened.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
So does that mean the ritual in itself was ineffective?
Yes.
Like it didn't actually confer anything?
I'm guessing so. That's actually a really interesting sense. When we think about holy orders, we consider them having what we call an ontological change. So when I was made a bishop today, I'm a bishop forever. No matter what I do, that's what I am. There is a change in me and, you know, in Sean, in Tim, that is indelible and cannot be removed no matter what I do. Doesn't mean I have to use it. Doesn't mean I could be restricted from using it, but it's there regardless. So certainly then they're definitely not talking about an ontological change. And that would be one of the reasons why when theologians look at the Cathars, they go, you know, there's leadership, but they're definitely not priests. They're definitely not clerics because they don't fit our narrow idea of what makes a cleric, you know.
Maybe they see it the way Catholics view annulment. Yeah, in the sense that they make a determination or because of circumstances, where they say that, well, it turns out the marriage was never effective. So it turns out maybe the ordination
I suppose. So there was never, but see, then that still brings up the question, well, there was never an ontological change.
Yeah.
So the ritual itself doesn't bring about an ontological change. Someone's commitment brings about it's confusing and gross.
The ontological thing is like, it's medieval Catholic sacramental
It is.
theology.
It's again, you can thank Dominicans. It's scholasticism.
It's scholasticism, and it's in the wake of Donatism in the African church in the 2nd century, 4th century, right? So just Donatism is the idea that, well, that your virtue impacts on your capacity to be a priest. So if you take all the money out of the church bank account and spend it on hookers and blow, you were never a priest in the first place.
Sorry, that's not what you meant.
Yep.
There was a thing essentially because you had Christians that were compelled under various circumstances to offer incense to Roman emperors and Roman deities. The question, once the persecution went away and Christianity was the state thing, the question is, what happens to those clergy, or the baptized more specifically, baptized folks and also clergy, what happens to the folks that offered incense? This is where we get the word traitor from, because it comes from either the Latin or the Italian, traditore, which means to hand over. So people would hand over their scriptures, to be confiscated, and they would offer incense to idols, etc. And so there was a question of whether or not it caused them to lose their ordination or lose their baptism. And the church said no, because the human being isn't the minister of the sacrament, Christ is. That's why it's effective regardless. And frankly, if they hadn't settled that, you'd have no church.
No, that's right. There'd be no one left.
I mean, and this is part of the reason, other than, mass killing, this is also part of the reason why the Cathars disappeared, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not ideal evolutionary coding for an organisation.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. You do something wrong once and everyone's out,
At the end of the day, if you look from modern terms, we could also argue this was the early stages of risk management and damage control.
Yeah.
Because, like you were saying, if you do willingly or unwillingly a mistake, which may land not well, it would have a chain cascade, which could eradicate immediately a lot of communities. That means you damage the entire church. So even if the idea was maybe good in the beginning, they may have realized that this has catastrophic impact. So damage control is, okay, we acknowledge you are human, and it's still good. Even if you are out, the other ones are still good, and that means the machinery can go along. I think this is the early evidence of risk management.
Absolutely.
You can insert a joke about the Cathars and the Cathars and cancel culture or something.
Yeah.
Taking it too far.
Yeah, that's right.
It's pretty extreme cancel culture.
Very extreme indeed. Okay, so whilst that ritual in and of itself doesn't really meet the requirements of ordination from an Orthodox Christian perspective, it appears that the consolamentum may have well been a Bogomil and Cathar ordination rite of sorts. There are clear lines of rank, importance and practice drawn between the perfect and the believers amongst the Cathars. The believers were to greet the perfect in a ritualised, deferential way. They were to call for their work of prayer to make them worthy of the consolamentum. Only the perfect could offer the central Cathar prayer, which was the Our Father, as sort of we know it. And only the perfect could bless bread before a meal. Whilst not being a communion ritual, it is kind of analogous of that idea of breaking bread together makes us a community. Jesus broke bread with his community, so we do the same thing. There is some suggestion that the Cathars and Bogomils saw within their consolamentum style rites a form of what today could be called apostolic succession. To them, succession was the passing on of the consolamentum, and they believed that that had been passed on generation to generation since the apostles, and that the apostles all received the exact same rite as them at the hands of Christ, at his ghosty hands, not his physical hands.
How do they reconcile that? So nobody sinned over the course of that time?
Clearly, none of the apostles and none of the... no one had sinned and it was all okay. Clearly, or at least there was enough of them to make it all right. But it's much like us in the institutional narrative. It's nice myth.
Well,
It's nice myth and it works.
according to the Cathars, chopping off people's ears is fair game.
Yeah,
I mean, if it was okay for Peter, then there we go.
indeed. But maybe he wasn't one who passed on the consolamentum to the Cathars. Who knows? There's also evidence that Cathars and Bogomils both had bishops and deacons, though their exact nature of the role that they fulfilled isn't clear at all. Basically, we just know they had them. The Bogomil bishop, so the Bogomil leader, who most writing that I could find, the conjecture was he was most likely a Bogomil bishop, from Constantinople, is recorded having attended a council with Cathar leaders at, and there's probably a lovely way to pronounce it in French, but St. Felix, where not only the consolamentum was given again, so we've all been receiving the consolamentum, but let's give it again anyway, so we're getting this other lineage as well. We've been doing it by ourselves, but here are these other guys who are doing it as well. Let's get their good juice, just in case our good juice isn't good enough, we'll switch and change. But some of those present, apart from receiving the consolamentum again, were actually set apart as bishops by the visiting Bogomil. These new Cathar bishops were then given geographical zones that they were to look after that very much mirrored the Roman Catholic diocese of the time. So where there was a Catholic bishop from that point on, there was also a a Cathar bishop, to either produce a replacement or competition to the Catholic hierarchy. In this case, the role of the bishop may have been seen as similar to the Roman Catholic model, given that it mirrored it. It was in geographical areas, and they were often, in the Roman Church, political, kind of governmental structured areas. So it kind of makes sense through that silhouette of kind of association that maybe those bishops did do the similar role to mainstream Christian bishops, making sure that administration was right, that there was a certain level of conformity, that business was being done in the Cathar way and everyone was doing the right thing. This then brings us to the modern era. So a big long stretch of time from middle-aged Cathars to what we could term modern history. The Apostolic Johannite Church, apart from standing in the lineage of mainstream Christian apostolic succession, also finds our roots, whether mythical or lineal, stretching into antiquity through the French Gnostic restoration of Jules Doinel. Jules Doinel was a rather interesting character. I'm not going to get into talking lots about him today. But yeah, interesting to say the least. In France at the time, there was a great revival of all things oddly spiritual and esoteric outside of the mainstream. Things like Spiritism had become very popular. The idea of seances and table rappings, and it was all extremely, extremely popular. So Jules Doinel was in these communities, and he had an experience where he received a series of visions and spiritual visitations in the late 19th century. What's kind of interesting when we talk about these experiences, he was an archivist, and just so happened that in his archives were Cathar documents with lots of people's names in it and all sorts of wonderful stuff. And lo and behold, Jules Doinel has a vision that includes all of these named Cathar bishops coming to visit him and make him a Cathar bishop. He has a message from the Aeon Sophia, who restores basically the great Gnostic tradition of Valentinus and the Cathars through mystical message. And we see that in our liturgy. The one has brought forth the one, then one, and will go forth, re-establish. I don't know the words off by heart. We'll talk about it tomorrow. It's in the lectionary readings for tomorrow, the exact wording. But basically, he gets commissioned to go off and establish a church. Now, he doesn't run out and find anyone that exists to lay hands on him. Just like the Cathars believed that Ghost Jesus was good enough to pass on succession to the apostles in the consolamentum on down to them, Jules Doinel believed that this was all he needed to go out and establish a Gnostic church. So today, apart from passing on traditional Roman Catholic apostolic succession and Eastern Orthodox and all sorts of lines, Sean and Tim also passed on that spiritual lineage of Jules Doinel as well. Whether anything really happened or not, who knows? We can only take people on their face value words, but he had an experience. And it was a profound experience at, if nothing else, a psychological, psycho-spiritual level that made a change within him, and he passed that change on to others. That's significant in and of itself, even if it wasn't Bogomil bishops and it wasn't the Aeon Sophia. And I mean, it well and truly could have been, who knows? I wasn't there. But either way, it's an important thing that we pass on. Myth is important, and again, that's a talk in and of itself about the importance of myth and what that does for us on that psycho-spiritual level, being a part of that myth and part of those archetypes. But anyway, after having those visions, Doinel established the L'Église Gnostique de France to be the re-establishment of ancient Valentinian Gnosticism and the Cathar movement, which for his time was kind of interesting because this is pre-Nag Hammadi, pre all of that sort of stuff. I think really all they had was the Pistis Sophia. Would have there been much else at that time? I don't. Yeah? Yeah. So that's what he was working with, and he developed a fully fledged ecclesiastical organisation that was very complex on a lot of levels, with a variety of established organisations and doctrinal and structural changes going on. And whilst it's not really within the scope of what I'm talking about today to outline the history in depth, I will try and outline a little bit of a map of the evolution of the role of holy orders within the groups that came after Doinel. Doinel has an interesting history. He left the church, he came back to the church, he left successors left successors that didn't like successors, that split off. It's an interesting and wonderful history that could be more than one talk in and of itself. And have you covered that? I think you've covered that in some of your talks. Will did. I knew someone did, yeah. And they're actually really good talks.
We have a new one sitting in the bank to go at some point from Dr. Siobhan Houston.
Yeah, and that wasn't a bad talk at all either.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
If the hands laid on, what is transferred? And let's say at one stage you may give something further. Mm-hmm. Is there anything known about a dilution effect? Or do we have a dilution effect? Where you could say, if let's say in the beginning it was Christ, even the ghost hands, so that is one part. Let's say that is 100%. And if you then trickle it down, is there a dilution effect? Do we know anything about it?
I think any answer to that would be purely speculative. Does giving people the Holy Ghost in confirmation diminish the Holy Ghost? I would like to think not. The Holy Ghost doesn't get smaller by me confirming someone. In fact, the spread of the Holy Ghost gets bigger. And so I think in ordination, I'd like to think of it like an absolute perfect photographic reproduction from the original film, not from a photo of a photo of a photo. So it's a reprint, not a photocopy that's been photocopied and diminished and diminished and diminished.
Yeah.
It's the exact same thing, put in a new package and handed over.
I think it's worth noting, though, that lineage-wise, ordination-wise, initiation-wise, there is such a thing as Gnostic and esoteric inbreeding. And while it doesn't produce extra fingers or toes, it has made a lot of idiots. Just throwing that out there. I have strong opinions.
They're sort of related. There is certain branches of things do subscribe to a kind of pollution theory, that if you've been initiated in some things, those things might be incompatible with other things you've been initiated in, and so the one can pollute the other. So if you've taken certain initiations, then that pollutes somehow apostolic succession and it can't be passed on. That's not a view that we subscribe to. So that's a perspective. I guess the other thing I'd just kind of add or kind of ask, I mean, it's an interesting question, but what's the methodology for discovering the truth? And the only, I'm sure people have views, but the only one I'm aware of who's ever tried establishing a methodology to establish this stuff is Charles Leadbeater, who was magically clairvoyant. Not to say that he wasn't necessarily, but Leadbeater believed, and all of his followers in the Theosophical Society believed, that he could examine the energy channels in a person using clairvoyant sight. And using that power, again, not to say that he couldn't, and certainly people can see things, but he ordained Annie Besant and then claimed that the energy channels in her body were unable to carry the Christ energy that enabled her to confect the Eucharist appropriately, and that's the basis of the Liberal Catholic Church not ordaining women, because they did one experiment where a rival of Annie Besant's ordained her and examined her using his flawless instrument and decided that was that. And that's been that since 1932 or whenever that occurred.
His clairvoyant insight was also great at picking the next Messiah, so here we are.
Yeah. So,
Right,
yes.
you know.
Let's not digress into Krishnamurti. Ralph.
No.
I'm always up for trashing theosophy.
I'm just thinking also of, like, Pope water, that thing that when you get holy water, consecrated water, I believe in the kind of Roman Catholic belief is that if you have a cup of it and you mix it with less than that, then the whole thing becomes consecrated. Yeah. If it's a bit more than that, then the whole thing is like diluted and kind of bad. Which, because I saw somebody kind of write about it saying like his grandmother had a jug of Pope water from like years ago because she'd always just like, okay, it's this level, I'll fill it with, I'll tip it into there, now I've got more again, I'll refill the jug, right? Yeah, exactly. But I think when you think of it in that sense of, you're putting that transmission in, and then maybe that's, coming from a strongly lineage-focused tradition where that's their take on holy water, wouldn't surprise me if that's a similar thing on that.
I can't back this up. I don't remember the source. I'm really sorry. But I think in Hebrew tradition, there's two kinds of holiness. One is about something being set aside and kept pure, which can get diluted, right? Because if something's, that's the importance of purity rules, because if you don't have purity rules, then the things that have been set aside and kept pure are diluted. But then there's the kind of holiness that comes directly from God, which is overwhelming holiness, which makes things holy, which is where you get Pope water from. So there's kind of two concepts of holiness, and Hebrew tradition has both of them, but you've got to be clear which one you're using. And I think in the paradigm that we're all in, baptism, ordination, the sacraments are the outwelling of overwhelming divine purity, divine holiness onto the situation. Sorry.
No.
I was just going to add briefly for the people who crap on Doinel because he had a visionary ordination and all this stuff. And I mean, it kind of had the context of a spiritualist setting and all that stuff. It's important to note that the frickin' Apostle Paul was ordained by Ghost Jesus.
Amen.
And I think people forget about that, right?
Very conveniently.
Like, I'm not a big fan of Paul, but I mean, there's evidence to say that maybe not necessarily the immediate apostles, but the rest of the community certainly just said, okay, you're good, right? And it's probably that's right.
Yeah.
That's Ghost Jesus. I mean, but it is Ghost Jesus. That's the,
What is a ghost?
The doors of the room were locked, and then Christ appeared to them. It's not behaving like a physical manifestation. I think, Doinel's clearly an overambitious, highly imaginative book hoarder.
Yeah.
So he sets the.
There's hope for all of us.
I think he sets the template for all Gnostics thereafter. Really.
Yeah.
When you mentioned things like Spiritism were popular, I was going to throw out that opium was also popular. Yeah. Great tastes that go great together. Off the record.
Just to note that it is nearly 7 p.m, so we are all getting to the point in the evening where we may need some opium to keep going, Well, I'm pretty sure it makes you sleepy, so probably not.
It's probably true.
Yeah, no. Okay, so let's get back on task and off of opium.
Oh, there is one thing I should mention.
Can you just put your hand up and wait?
Sorry. So Bishop Tim made reference to the whole idea of purity. If you've been initiated in a particular thing, it affects your whatever in something else. We've actually had that leveled at us. People have said, oh, because you have members who may or may not have been involved in, say, the OTO, Thelema, that type of thing. My predecessor's history as a, younger man hanging out with the Temple of Set, right? They turn around and say, well, everything else is flawed because you've participated, you've lost your purity. The fun thing is, and this is where I bring the tea and spill it, is that some of these folks, particularly in the last 20, 30 years, who have harped on about Gnostic clergy who have been involved in the OTO, Thelema, whatever, left-hand path movements and all that stuff, and said that essentially they're not real modern Gnostics or French Gnostics as a result of it, were secretly Thelemites themselves. And there's a paper trail for that. I think it's hilarious. But
I'm with you.
yeah. I'm sure that's going to generate some comments on YouTube. It's gonna be good. A lot of French Gnostic churches are neither French nor Gnostic
Nor churches.
Every time I say that, I end it out and talk. Maybe this is the time where we just let it sit.
Carthago delendum est.
Okay, oh, good Lord. Now, let's try and sound academic again. As a supposed restoration of Cathar faith, obviously with Valentinian leanings, the priesthood of Doinel's church had a structure and role similar to that of the Cathars. There were bishops and deacons, with there being female equivalents, Sophias for bishops and deaconesses for deacons, clearly, and perfects as well, perfecti. Whilst those who were amongst the perfect, having received the consolamentum, could perform some clerical type functions like breaking of bread, the bishops and deacons were called to lead and establish the infant church. The right to bestow the consolamentum was restricted to bishops, so not to anyone who'd received the consolamentum, while deacons were called to lead congregations. The bishops were also to govern the church through a synodal structure, it's like a collegial structure, though in practice, Doinel appears to have often governed by decree as patriarch. Oh, I can see how we're related to Doinel. Isn't that interesting? In this period of development, the structure and purpose of the clergy, whilst linked to the medieval Cathar model, did take on a feel that was somewhat more familiar to the church of the time, with the clerical ranks being called to offer the three mysterious mysteries or sacraments of the church to its people. This development of the clerical rank continued into the next evolution of the French Gnostic Church, which came about with a change of leadership. Under the new leadership, not only the sacramental structure of the church changed, but the entire structure of the church and the place that those in holy orders held within the church underwent a huge esoteric evolution. The role of holy orders is extremely difficult to map at this point, as the church developed two distinct yet entirely enmeshed sides. There was the outwards facing church that new converts would initially experience, and then there was the inwards facing church, which consisted of an extremely complex set of initiatic degrees. The clergy were not only those who were called to lead and minister in the outward-facing church, but were also initiated into the highest ranks of the degree structure. It's in this stage of the evolution of the French church that we see the official documents clearly outlining the role of clergy, with a statement that the clergy are those who fulfills religious ministries, meaning preaching, celebrating mysteries, administering sacraments. In this way, we have seen a role for clergy, at least in the outward-facing church, develop that is similar to what existed in every other church at the time and in pretty much every other church that now. But that's not where the story ends. Like in all things modern, it just keeps on rolling. Okay, the next distinct change that came in the makeup of the clergy occurred not with a change of leadership alone, there was a change in leadership, but with a split between those in leadership positions. Whilst it suggested that the church established... Okay, so there was two churches that existed. One was led by a fellow called Jean Bricaud. That's right, is it? How you'd say it, Bricaud. So it's been suggested that the church established under him maintained both of the streams, the inward-facing initiatic orders and the outward-facing, we're priests, bishops, deacons, and essentially maintained the doctrine and maintained the role of clergy as before. There was some change. The ranks of those in holy orders were expanded to include the office of priest. So up until this point, there'd been no priests. Just bishops and Sophias, deacons and deaconesses. There were no priests in the middle. So the office of priest came around, and the traditional apostolic succession was received by Bricaud. Yeah, I didn't write down the name of who from. Was that from Mauviel? No? Yep. Okay. Oh, well, there you go. So it must be noted, though, that the concept of a lineal apostolic succession appears to have been modified by Bricaud's church through official documents, where it's stated that the priestly power does not come by I've written this sentence a bit weird. That the priestly power does come by virtue of a human lineage, but that it's only... okay, so the idea that apostolic succession, even though we got it from a person, doesn't really come from a person. It's a spiritual lineage, and we probably already had it anyway, so it doesn't really matter, but we've just done this thing because we could do it. Because, of course, we've been doing all this stuff already. We don't want to totally delegitimize everything we've done. We've just supercharged our Holy Spirit powers, is how they kind of framed it. The final and most radical departure from everything that had happened before and the orders of the French Gnostic lineage occurred under Robert Amblin. And it's at this point that we see the French Gnostic lineage take a form that is extremely familiar to those of us here in the AJC. That of at least exterior conformity with the traditional Roman model. Under Amblin, the French Gnostic Church accepted all three orders of priesthood, the 7 traditional sacraments, shed the initiatic structures with provisions for incarnations, and maintained the role of holy orders in much the same way as the mainstream Catholic Church. An examination of the place of holy orders in the Apostolic Johannite Church shows that we stand firmly in this melding kind of position of Gnostic faith and practice within the framework of Western and Eastern Catholic churches. In 2002, the then Patriarch of the Apostolic Johannite Church issued an encyclical, so that's Johannes III, which clearly elucidated the role of clergy within the church, and in his view, what should stand within the wider purview of Gnostic Christianity. The encyclical goes to great lengths to make it very clear that each individual Gnostic is ultimately responsible for their own salvation through Gnosis. It's not the role of the clergy to dispense the gift of Gnosis as though they are arbiters of ultimate wisdom, except for me, or some secret ceremony or personal power. Not to stand as an intermediary between the individual and the divine. So to be clerical without clericalism, I think, is really the point of that. Because in some other brands of Christianity, it's not only that they have clergy, but that they have clericalism. And that's the idea that without the clergy, there's no way that we could possibly understand anything that's going on or possibly understand how to be better people or how to achieve salvation, or it's just impossible. We need the clergy. Instead, the only powers of the clergy are ecclesiastical, that is, limited to the governance and maintenance of the church and its sacraments by virtue of their ordination. The clergy of the Apostolic Johannite Church stand as a guide and helpmeet along the road to individual illumination. The sacraments that we can offer may assist with spiritual strength. The example that they set and the advice that the clergy give may be of use, but only so much as it informs the walk of the individual and assists them to draw closer to the divine and embrace their own nature. Tau Johannes III makes this clear when he states, I've got a quote, "Gnosis and the sacred flame lead to the personal conviction that one's own true nature is divine. This information, however, is meaningless to the person unless it is truly a deep knowledge of the heart, as opposed to a purely intellectual belief or faith. A Gnostic priest is one who aids those in the pursuit of this experience as a source of theoretical and technical information, of spiritual guidance and reassurance, to answer their questions, resolve their doubts, and help them through their studies and meditations to come ultimately to the full personal realization of the Gnosis." As one who, that sentence is incorrect because I've already been licensed. Okay, so why then do we do all this stuff that we've done, and why do we have clergy in a church that's Gnostic? I suppose Tau Johannes, Ma Johannes, I don't know, whatever he called himself back then, kind of explains it in a nutshell. Those of us who are active clergy in the church aren't here to pontificate, aren't here to, stand as a beacon on the hill as something to follow. If there's one thing that I can say to the few of you who are still here, as a bishop, please don't copy me. I am far from from a perfect human being. I'm far from a worthy individual who needs to be emulated. But what I do have, and what I think I have, I don't know, because I am only me and know me, is I'd like to think that I have a big heart. And that's why I became a priest. That's why I wanted to be a priest. I looked to be a priest, and I'm just going to ignore the rest of this so we can be done. I looked to become a priest in the Anglican Church a long time ago, and was sent away because I was too young, and the Anglican Church regrets that now that they have no clergy because, anyway, that's another story we can discuss over dinner, as does every other church. But the one thing that really stopped me from doing that back then was the fact that I never actually wanted to lead a parish. I never actually wanted to be an administrative leader. And sadly, Thomas and Joanne, who have tried to work with me in keeping things running, can probably attest that I'm not much of an administrative leader. I have poor time management skills. I have a poor memory. I'm really bad at remembering to organise meetings. Yeah, well, thank God. Thank God. Thank God, But that's not the purpose that I see in my episcopacy. I don't know what other people see in their episcopacy, but what I see as my role as your bishop from this point on is to bring you love. In mainstream Catholic theology, priests are considered to stand as an alter Christus, another Christ, when they're working as a priest sacramentally. I, for want of being a heretic, heretic amongst heretics, I don't consider myself an alter Christus. This is going to sound a bit weird. I don't know what word to use. I believe I stand in the place of the mother. I may have dangly genitals, but it's hard to express the words that are in my heart, but if there's one thing that over my time as your leader I want to bring to you, it is the loving kindness of a mother that we all have and that isn't recognised enough, that isn't, that's hidden away in a box in a lot of ways that we are bringing out. That's not a criticism, it's not a criticism. But the loving kindness of that divine feminine, I think, is what needs to radiate out amongst our church. And to be honest, it's what radiates from the altar when we have the Eucharist. And it took me a long time to realise that. I've loved the Eucharist for a long time, but I've come to love it more since becoming, a world-hating, matter-hating Gnostic, because I'm able to look at it in a totally different way. As a priest in another tradition, what was important about the Eucharist was that the man Jesus became manifest on the altar. And that was terribly important to me, absolutely important. I spent many hours before the Eucharist worshipping Christ in the Eucharist. But what's clearly there now, or what I can clearly see when we wipe away the scholasticism, is that when we enter into the Holy of Holies, it's the Shekinah that's there. And Tim spoke about it beautifully earlier, and I just goosebumpies and that's it. That's it. No matter what our liturgy says, it's all about the Shekinah. It's all about the female presence of God. It's all about that all-encompassing, embracing, loving, maternal, caring, that flows out from the altar at the Eucharist. And if there was one thing I could bop you all on the head to feel what I feel at the Eucharist, especially since coming to that realisation. And that's my aim for my episcopacy, is to be able to instill that love of the Shekinah and the realisation of what lies at the heart of everything that we do in a world that is terribly masculine. Terribly masculine. And that's not a bad thing all the time, but I think it's overshadowed so many beautiful things in what we do. Anyway, I'm starting to ramble now, but the heart speaks and it says what it wants to say, but I love you all and will continue to love you all, and don't expect me to remember to ring you, but just know that I love you. The love is there, whether I remember that we had a meeting on Monday evening at 7 o'clock or not. But the love is always there, and no matter what you need, reach out. Don't be strangers. My email and my messenger are always open. Like any good mum, you can always come home to mum's apron and hide behind it, and I'll give you a glass of milk and a cookie, tell you that everything's all right, and then we'll fix the problem. So don't expect organisation, but expect love. And I hope that's okay. Don't expect organisation, but expect love.
I have long stopped expecting organization from the AGC and its bishops. I just thought I'd point that out.
I try to be organised, but it doesn't always work very well.
There's a couple of historic things talking about, and people always, the modern Gnostic churches always frame this thing like, are we just copying the Catholics? Are we just copying the Orthodox? Why do we do the blah, blah, blah? Here's me going to bitch about that one thing. The idea of lineage, apostolic succession, that did not originate with the Proto-Orthodox Church or the Great Church. It originated with the Gnostics.
Yeah.
How do I know this? Because there's a smart guy by the name of Dr. David Brackey who points out the fact that the Valentinians originated the concept of apostolic succession, specifically because Valentinus was initiated and taught by Theudas, who was initiated and taught by the Apostle Paul, also Ghost Jesus, by the way. But that started there. So the other folks, like Tertullian, started unfurling their line of bishops, as the quote goes, in response to what the Gnostics were doing. Similarly, the only reason why Christianity has a canon of Scripture is because heretics came up with one first.
That's right.
Right?
Marcion had his
right?
first.
I mean, he was kind of a dick, but just the same. you know, a lot of these things that early Christianity does or pioneers is all reactionary.
Yeah.
The creeds exist to say what they weren't, not who they were.
Yeah.
Right? And it was a response to Gnosticism,
Yeah.
Lineage response to Gnosticism, canon response to Gnosticism.
Apparently, the Arians had all the best music and were taking all the congregations, so the Orthodox Church had to lift its music game in order to compete with the Arians.
Yeah. So 7 o'clock and we're all done.
It's not bad. And good talk, by the way. Thank
No,
you.
no questions, right?
Oh, if there are questions, we can take them when we eat food, you know? Anyway.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Your Grace.
No, Father's all right.